Karl Marx's great contribution to the world was in the area of historical materialism and dialectical materialism, something you need to know if you know about socialism. But since you don't know about socialism, you don't even know the words. And not only does the enemy keep you ignorant, you stay ignorant. You won't ever go read a book about socialism. Why read a book about socialism? They already told me in my class it ain't no good. We come to inspire you to learn. We come to tell you that when you come to serve a people, you must know as much as you can. The more you know, the better able you are to serve the people.
Saludos a todos. My name is Ramiro. I'm one of the 5 co-editors of Anticonquista. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And welcome to episode 13 of Decolonizing Media. Decolonizing Media is a video podcast that's dedicated to exposing capitalist and imperialist ideology in mainstream media, especially when we're talking about Latin America, the Caribbean, and socialism. Before we start, I want to remind y'all to head over to patreon.com/anticonquista and become a patron today. Only part of the money that we collect goes to pay for our website and podcast hosting fees, and the rest of that money goes directly to groups in Latin America and the Caribbean that are serving the people. So head over to patreon.com/anticonquista and fund the resistance today. Now, with that out of the way, let's jump right into episode 13 of Decolonizing Media, the Science of Marxism. In September of 1999, the BBC conducted a worldwide poll to vote on the greatest thinker of the millennium. Among the many included were Immanuel Kant, René Descartes, and Stephen Hawking. To the surprise of a lot of people in the West, including the BBC itself, Karl Marx topped the list. Karl Marx was a German revolutionary, economist, philosopher, journalist, historian, and sociologist. Marx, along with his compañero Friedrich Engels, formulated the theory and the practice of scientific socialism. Not only did they participate in workers' uprisings in Europe during the mid-19th century, they also inspired dozens of socialist revolutions throughout the 20th century, especially in the global South. And even today, in the 21st century, Marxism is becoming increasingly popular again. So it's no surprise why Marx is considered to be one of the most important thinkers in human history, at least to those of us who aren't entirely brainwashed by Western imperialist propaganda. But not surprisingly, Marxism has gotten a bad rap in mainstream media, even today on YouTube. And I'm not just talking about the lie that socialism has never worked anywhere it's been tried. That's something we've already debunked with economic statistics in previous episodes. I'm talking about the lie that Marxism is some sort of crazy religion, a religion that's static, utopian, subjective, dogmatic, and out of touch with reality, when in fact Marxism is a science that's constantly evolving, adapting, and taking in new information based on the changing circumstances of objective reality. A body of knowledge that borrows concepts from the natural sciences like physics, biology, and chemistry and applies them to the social sciences like politics, economics, and history, treating them as interconnected pieces of one totality. On YouTube, one of the main talking heads misrepresenting Marxism and outright spreading lies about Marxism is a man named Jordan Peterson. Peterson, who's a clinical psychologist and psychology professor from Canada, has become somewhat of a hero within right-wing circles, especially in the West. Unfortunately, his videos attempting to discredit Marxism and write it off as some sort of crazy religion have gotten millions of views, perpetuating the same mainstream media myths about Marxism. Here's some of what he said in the past.
What can Marxism contribute to our modern-day world? By Arni.
It can contribute Venezuela, and it has. So I'll be a little bit less cynical in my answer, but We've seen what it can contribute. I don't know how many bloody times we have to run the experiment. No, that wasn't real Marxism. I know what that means. I know what that sentence means. What that means is, well, if I was the dictator, with my profound understanding of Marx's real intent, and my universal benevolent compassion, uncontaminated by any proclivity towards darkness or sin, I would bring on the socialist utopia. You have the Marxist story, which is, well, there's oppressed people, and the reason they're oppressed and suffering is because the oppressors are oppressing them. And there's a utopianism that's implicit in Marxism, which is if you could just get the damn oppressors to stop oppressing the oppressed, then the utopia would arrive. And so not only are the oppressors responsible for the suffering of the poor, they're also responsible for the fact that the utopia isn't here for everyone.
All of what you've just heard are common talking points that anti-communists like Jordan Peterson use to deceive us about Marxism. Not only do they make outrageous claims about the history and practice of Marxism that are just straight up false, they entirely leave out the ideological roots of Marxism, never once attempting to properly explain its philosophical outlook on reality and its method of analysis. This does a major disservice to Marxism because it reduces it down to a static and unchanging belief set where there is no such thing as objective reality and where everything is relative. But in an era when the dominant trends of thought, like liberalism, conservatism, and religion, are unable to explain global crises, the need to truly understand the core philosophy of Marxism has become more urgent than ever before. And that's exactly what we're about to do now. We're going to go over the basics of Marxist philosophy, explaining how and why Marxists view the world in the ways that they do. We're going to focus on two core philosophical components of Marxism: dialectical materialism and historical materialism. We're going to show how both of these can be used to better understand the world and change it for the good of all poor and colonized people like ourselves. And in doing so, we can debunk this widespread narrative in mainstream media that Marxism is somehow an outdated dogmatic religion. We can demonstrate that Marxism is truly a science and a weapon for revolutionary change. For those of you who are interested, I published an article for Anticonquista about 2 years ago titled Dialectical Materialism, the Science of Marxism Explained. Much of what we're about to talk about right now is laid out in that article. And if you feel like I'm missing something or I'm getting something wrong, hit me up and let me know. After all, I'm still studying all of this myself and have a lot more to learn, so that would be greatly appreciated. So with all of that said, let's go over dialectical and historical materialism, the science of Marxism. First, we'll go over dialectical materialism, and then we'll go into historical materialism. Dialectical materialism is the world outlook of Marxism. It's called dialectical materialism because its approach to the phenomena of nature, its method of studying and apprehending them, is dialectical, while its interpretation of the phenomena of nature, its understanding of these phenomena, is materialistic. Let's break down what this means, starting with materialism. In philosophy, materialism is the understanding that matter is the primary and determinate substance in the natural world. All things, including ideas and consciousness, are a result of interactions between matter. In other words, the material world determines consciousness. And contrary to idealism, which denies the possibility of knowing the world and its laws, which doesn't believe in the authenticity of our knowledge, doesn't recognize objective truth, and holds that the world is full of things in themselves that can never be known to science, Marxist philosophical materialism holds that the world and its laws are fully knowable, that our knowledge of the laws of nature, tested by experiment and practice, is authentic knowledge having the validity of objective truth, and that there are no things in the world which are unknowable, but only things which are still not known that will eventually come to light and become known by the efforts of science and practice in the material world. As Marx put it, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness, unquote. Marx wrote extensively about materialism in his 1846 pamphlet titled The German Ideology. In the pamphlet, he drew inspiration from Ludwig Feuerbach, another atheist German philosopher of his time, who criticized religion for its idealist world outlook. Feuerbach, by the way, inspired Charles Darwin and Friedrich Nietzsche, who were also critical of religious and idealist thought. Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin also wrote extensively about the meaning of materialism in his 1909 pamphlet, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. You've probably heard the frequently asked question, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Materialists answer this question with yes. That's because they understand that consciousness and perception is secondary to material interaction. The brain, which acts like the traffic control center of the human nervous system and its sensory organs, acquires knowledge about a particular thing through sense perception. Sense perception allows consciousness to be developed about that particular thing that we're feeling, seeing, hearing, or tasting. For example, the sound of a tree falling enters our ear canal, then it's instantaneously processed by our brain, and then we become conscious that a tree has fallen. Ultimately, it's the interactions between ears, brains, and trees, all physical things which occupy material space, that allow us to cognitively understand that a tree has fallen. Even if no one's around to hear the tree falling, it'll still make a sound since it's interacting with other material objects like the Earth's surface. Materialists also argue, for example, that the Earth was still orbiting around the Sun way before humans even discovered the fact that the Earth orbits around the Sun. The Earth didn't begin orbiting around the Sun in the 16th century when the model of heliocentrism was scientifically introduced and when humans first had consciousness of a solar system. This process began millions of years prior to that, independent of human thought. And I'm sure we've all heard Descartes' famous expression, cogito ergo sum, or, quote, I think, therefore I am. Materialists reverse this statement, saying, I am, therefore I think. Overall, materialism maintains that interactions between material substances and reality determines ideas and consciousness, not the other way around as idealism holds. Idealism, which argues that ideas determine material reality, is prevalent in liberalism, conservatism, and religion. In liberalism, it takes the form of the idea that peace can be achieved if we all put our ideological differences aside. In conservatism, it takes the form of the idea that you can be rich if you work hard enough. In religion, it takes the form of the idea that you'll go to heaven if you pray hard enough. All of these arguments fail to take into consideration material conditions that determine whether these possibilities can even happen. Peace can't be achieved between two nations or two classes if one side's existence and growth is dependent on the destruction and exploitation of the other. You can't become rich if you don't have the money to invest in a business or go to school, which is the case for most people in the world. And you can't go to heaven if there's never been any material scientific proof of its existence. And even within the anti-capitalist left, political trends like anarchism fail to understand materialism, manifesting itself in disagreements over tactics like overthrowing capitalism and building a stateless, classless society, which anarchists and communists both want at the end of the day. The ideological failure of idealist socialists like anarchists lies in the fact that they don't recognize the primary role which the conditions of material life play in the development of society. And sinking to idealism, they don't base their practical activities on the needs of the actually existing material life of society. Instead, they operate independently of and in spite of these needs, focusing on ideal plans that are divorced from the real life of society. Historically, with anarchists, this occurs during two moments of revolutionary struggles. First, when they advocate for an immediate and total violent revolution, even though the conditions aren't yet ripe. And second, when they criticize socialist governments for not dismantling capitalism fast enough and for still having a state apparatus even though the conditions aren't yet ripe to do so. Materialist socialism isn't guided by illusions and utopias. It's guided by science, material conditions, and objective reality. And while materialists believe that ideas can and do influence material reality is ultimately the determining factor. It's like a 60-40 relationship, where 60% of an outcome is determined by the material, and where the remaining 40% is determined by the ideal. Chinese revolutionary Mao Zedong said it best in 1963 when he said, quote, "Where do correct ideas come from? Do they drop from the skies? No. Are they innate in the mind? No. They come from social practice, and from it alone. They come from three kinds of social practice: the struggle for production, the class struggle, and scientific experiment. It is man's social being that determines his thinking. Once the correct ideas characteristic of the advanced class are grasped by the masses, these ideas turn into a material force which changes society and changes the world." Now that we've gone over materialism, which is the Marxist interpretation of nature, let's jump into dialectics, which is the Marxist method of understanding nature. Again, the dialectic is a philosophical method of understanding the way things are and how they change. Marx and Engels adopted the dialectical method of their ideological predecessor, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and updated it with a materialist understanding of reality. While Hegel was a dialectician, he was also an idealist, believing that ideas determine material reality. But as Marx himself said, quote, "My dialectical method is fundamentally not only different from the Hegelian, but its direct opposite. To Hegel, the process of thinking, which under the name of the idea, he even transforms into an independent subject, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external phenomenal form of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought." Unquote. Grounded in scientific laws found in quantum mechanics and astronomy, the materialist dialectic maintains that all things that exist in the universe are interconnected processes in constant motion. In other words, we live in a universe of constantly changing processes, not static things. As the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, quote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." Unquote. The dialectical method stands in opposition to metaphysics, which analyzes processes that exist in the universe as isolated things frozen in time. Liberalism, conservatism, and religion are all steeped in metaphysical thought. Let's take humans as an example. A metaphysical approach to studying human development takes the average human being as they are now and acts like they've been this way from the beginning. Hence, the argument that greed is human nature, which is used to justify the current Darwinistic capitalist system, where selfishness and greed are considered the natural order of things. This view entirely ignores the thousands of years of communal living that existed prior to capitalism and feudalism. It also separates humans from their environments and makes value judgments about them, acting as though they exist outside of their immediate surroundings. This includes universally judging humans for stealing food, not taking into account that a small minority of them live in places where food is abundant, while a vast majority live in places where it's scarce. A dialectical approach to studying human development recognizes that humans are extensions of nature and are constantly evolving and changing based on their material conditions. With that in mind, it doesn't make sense to make universal and one-size-fits-all value judgments about humans while different standards of living exist. Aside from the understanding that all things that exist in the universe are interconnected processes in constant motion, there are three central laws of the dialectic. 1. The unity of opposites. 2. The passage of quantitative changes into qualitative changes. And 3. The negation of the negation. The law of the unity of opposites maintains that all processes that exist in the universe contains two contradictory elements that form a larger totality. Although these two elements are diametrically opposed to one another, they're also codependent on each other. Within each atom, for example, there exist electrons, which emit negative charges, and protons, which emit positive charges. While these atomic components are complete opposites in their composition and function, both are needed to form the totality of an atom. Additionally, in each dialectical relationship between polar opposites, one element is dominant over the other. In Hegel's book published in 1812 titled The Science of Logic, he explained the dialectic using the triad model of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Engels elaborated on this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis triad model in his unfinished pamphlet, The Dialectics of Nature, published in 1883. Mao also discussed this in his 1937 essay on contradiction. The law of the passage of quantitative changes into qualitative changes states that when one component of a particular process increases in quantity and becomes the dominant component, a qualitative shift occurs in the totality of the process. Let's go back to the example of atoms. If electrons in a particular atom increase in quantity, the atom's overall charge will become negative. If protons in that same atom replace electrons as the dominant component, it'll become positive. The domination of one component, a thesis, over another component, an antithesis, creates an entirely new process with qualitatively new composition, a synthesis. Within the synthesis, elements of both the original thesis and antithesis exist, with one being dominant over the other. For example, if you throw a cup of hot water into a bucket of cold water, the water in the bucket will become a bit warmer, but for the most part it'll remain cold. Engels has some other good examples of this law in the natural world in the Dialectics of Nature. At one point he says, quote, "The temperature of water has at first no effect on its liquid state. But as the temperature of liquid water rises or falls, a moment arrives when this state of cohesion changes and the water is converted in one case into steam and in the other into ice. Every metal has its melting temperature. Every liquid has its critical point at which, by proper pressure and cooling, it can be converted into a liquid state. What are known as the constants of physics are in most cases nothing but designations for the nodal points at which quantitative increase or decrease of movement causes a qualitative change in the state of the given body, at which consequently quantity is transformed into quality." Unquote. Lastly, the law of the negation explains the cycle of development that all processes undergo, in line with the thesis, antithesis, synthesis model. It maintains that all processes come into being, wither away, and later come back in a new, higher, and evolved form. This cycle doesn't end at the exact point where it started, as it would if its trajectory of motion were a circle. Instead, it ends up in a new, higher, and evolved position as it moves in the shape of a spiral. If this sounds confusing, let's take a look at how trees work for a moment to better understand this third law of dialectics. A tree comes into being in the form of a seed that grows in the soil and eventually becomes tall and strong. The same tree, however, eventually withers away, dropping its seeds on the soil it's planted on. Eventually, the seeds produced by the one dying tree can create 20 trees in its place. Thus, the creation of 20 trees negates the negation, or the withering away, of the first tree. Essentially, something becomes its opposite, establishing the first negation. Then it becomes its opposite again, but in a new, higher, and evolved position. As Engels also put it, quote, "All nature, from the smallest thing to the biggest, from a grain of sand to the sun, from the protista to man, is in a constant state of coming into being and going out of being, in a constant flux, in a ceaseless state of movement and change." Unquote. This is the negation of the negation, and we see it happen in our everyday lives. When night becomes day, and when day becomes night. When warm weather becomes cold weather, and when cold weather becomes warm weather. When low tide waves become high tide waves, and when high tide waves become low tide waves. Up to this point, we've gone over dialectical materialism mainly as it's applied to nature, such as sound, atomic structure, botany, and liquid substances. Now, let's go over dialectical materialism as it's applied to society, such as in history, politics, and economics. Historical materialism is the extension of the principles of dialectical materialism to the study of social life. Historical materialism applies the methods of dialectical materialism to the phenomena of the life of society, to the study of society and its history. In doing so, Marx and Engels discovered the centrality of revolutions in the study of society, serving as the locomotives of history. In other words, revolutions of millions of people, not the actions of one individual in particular, are what move history from one era to another. Revolution can be defined as the forcible overthrow of a social order in favor of a new system. The term revolution was popularized during the time of Copernicus, when those who, like Copernicus, believed that the earth revolves around the sun, were described as revolutionaries. During that time, of course, supporting this idea was dangerous and often led to death, since the backward Roman Catholic Church believed otherwise. From then on, revolutionaries came to be known as people who daringly questioned and fought against the backward establishment and promoted science. Marx summed up the centrality of revolutions in his landmark work, Capital, Critique of Political Economy, with the following quote: "Revolution is the midwife of every old society, which is pregnant with a new one." Also central to the Marxist science of historical materialism are two key concepts. One, modes of production, and two, relations of production. The mode of production is the system by which humans in any particular era of history procure the wealth and resources needed to survive and sustain themselves. Things like food, clothing, and housing. In order to live, people must have these things. And in order to have these things, people must have instruments of production, with which food, clothing, and housing can be produced. During different eras of history, different modes of production have existed. These modes of production are partially defined by which instruments are used to secure the basic essentials of human sustenance. Some, of course, are more advanced than others. Relations of production are the relation of people to one another in a particular mode of production, in a particular era of history. Humans, as Marx has pointed out, are social beings. They carry on a struggle against nature and utilize nature for the production of material values, not in isolation from each other, not as separate individuals, but in common, in groups of societies. As Marx himself once said, quote, "In production, men not only act on nature, but also on one another. They produce only by cooperating in a certain way and mutually exchanging their activities. In order to produce, they enter into definite connections and relations with one another, and only within these social connections and relations does their action on nature, does production take place." Unquote. In essence, the relations of production refer to how the wealth that is commonly produced within each society is divided and shared. Within each time period of human civilization, different modes of production and relations of production have existed, based on the material conditions that exist within those periods. Marx divides the entirety of human history into 5 eras: communalism, sometimes called primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. Within each era, a change in material conditions gives rise to new modes of production and relations of production, and thus also gives rise to increased conflict between two opposing classes, resulting in one overturning the other and the ushering in of a new era of society. During primitive communism, also known as communalism, humans lived in tribal units that depended on hunting and gathering and didn't adhere to private property. This era lasted for thousands of years and forms the majority of humanity's history. However, as material conditions changed in ways that facilitated the rise of farming tools and weapons technology, a new class of property owners arose. These property owners then began conquering other tribal units introducing the rule of slave owners and slave society as a whole. During slave society, world powers like the Roman and Macedonian empires were ruled by slave owners on a quest to conquer humans and resources. This was the beginning of what is known as class society as a whole. However, as disease, infrastructure decay, rising poverty levels, and Christianity, which opposed the development of science and technology, became commonplace within these empires, they began to decline. The rule of kings, queens, clergy, and the nobility replaced these slave empires, oppressing feudal serfs who were former slaves and who worked on their land. During feudalism, which lasted from about 900 AD to roughly the late 19th century, also depending on the region, kings, queens, clergy, and the nobility ruled the world in small units of feudal territories. Nations did not yet exist, and feudal serfs were confined to regional estates where they worked in exchange for food and housing. The technological advancements of the European Renaissance, however, which was grounded on the so-called discovery of the so-called New World and its subsequent colonization, introduced the rise of port cities where stolen goods from the Third World were brought in. As a result, a new class of oppressors, known as capitalists, began industrializing coastal areas and developed urban settlements, where feudal serfs fled to in order to begin working in factories. Urban liberal capitalists replaced conservative and religious feudal landlords as the ruling class, and events like the Industrial Revolution were their impetus. Under capitalism, our current era of society, capitalists rule the world carved up into artificially constructed borders that form nation-states. Capitalists are rich people who exploit workers and peasants and control the world's population in order to advance their wealth. Most of them live in the first world, in North America, Europe, Australia, and Japan, and exploit workers in the third world, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Capitalists, who are referred to as the bourgeoisie, get rich off of stolen value produced by workers and peasants, known as the proletariat, who overwhelmingly make up the majority of the world's population. However, Marx, Lenin, and countless other communist revolutionaries have correctly pointed out that with only a finite amount of resources and workers to exploit in the world, the rule of the capitalists will eventually come crashing down. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism which we're currently in now, is capitalism in decay. Now we're at the point where we, as proletarians, can carry out a worldwide revolution, replacing the bourgeoisie as the ruling class and seizing control of the world's production, ushering in a new and fifth stage of humanity, socialism. Under socialism, which has already been witnessed in places like the Soviet Union, Cuba, China, and other countries, class struggle by the ruling proletariat against the bourgeoisie continues. As production becomes centralized in the hands of workers and as poverty is eliminated, material conditions change, giving way to the long march toward global communism. Communism, which has never yet been achieved, is a stateless, classless, yet highly organized global society based on material abundance that succeeds socialism. It can take hundreds, if not thousands of years to reach full communism. Communism is a higher and more developed form of the communalism that existed thousands of years ago, functioning as the negation of communalism. That's why Marx described many ancient societies as primitive communist societies. Not because he viewed these societies as primitive, but because these societies had local and small-scale forms of communism that could eventually be implemented on a global level, granted that the material conditions are ripe. Within this sketch of historical materialism, we can see how dialectical materialism can be applied to understanding society. Materialism demonstrates that changes in modes of production and relations of production lead to social revolutions, forcing society into new eras of struggle between two contending classes. This has been the case in all preceding eras of history. For example, humans didn't wake up one day and decide to become capitalists and introduce a whole new way of organizing society. The Industrial Revolution and changes in the material world thrust them into that position, which they gladly accepted. Also, the dialectic explains the nature of these societal changes, especially as it relates to their composition and motion. Here are a few examples. The dialectical understanding that the universe is comprised of interconnected processes in constant motion explains how society transitions from one era to another in constant ebbs and flows. During the transition from feudalism to capitalism, for example, elements of both societies were seen. There wasn't an exact date when humans announced that they've officially left the era of feudalism and have now officially begun capitalism. At the beginning of this transition, feudalism was dominant and the seeds of capitalism were manifesting. At the end of this transition, capitalism was dominant and the ashes of feudalism were withering away. The dialectical law of the unity of opposites also explains how within each era of society, two diametrically opposed classes are dependent on one another. Just as you can't have hot without cold or day without night, you can't have capitalists without workers. Each class identifies itself in relation to its opposite class. Finally, the dialectical law of the negation explains how humans transition from classless society under communalism over to class society under slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, and later back to classless society under socialism and eventually communism. This is possible only if we're able to bring the contradiction of class society to its logical conclusion and successfully overthrow capitalism. Class society was the negation of primitive communism, but socialism and communism will be the negation of class society, thus negating the negation. Socialism and communism represent a higher and more developed stage of communalism as it moves in the trajectory of an upward spiral. These are the basic tenets of historical materialism, which again is the extension of the principles of dialectical materialism to the study of social life. So with all of this in mind, we can easily refute the idea that Marxism is some sort of crazy religion, which unfortunately has become widespread on platforms like YouTube. Marxism is not, like Jordan Peterson and many others in mainstream media describe it, some static, utopian, subjective, dogmatic, and out-of-touch belief set. Marxism is a science. It's a science that's constantly evolving, constantly adapting, and always taking in new information based on the changing circumstances of objective reality. The flexibility and adaptability of Marxism allows it to apply concepts from the natural sciences to the social sciences, treating them as interconnected pieces of one totality. Marxism is a tool for better understanding the world and changing it for the betterment of the world's most oppressed people. Not once do the enemies of Marxism even attempt to explain dialectical and historical materialism. That's probably because they haven't even bothered to study it themselves. And that's also why it's up to us as Marxists to seriously study and reclaim our beautiful proletarian science, adapting it to the 21st century. As Marx himself said, quote, "There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits." Unquote. So that's all for today. Thanks again for listening and watching. And by the way, for those of you who are interested in learning more about dialectical and historical materialism, I highly recommend these books. I've personally learned a lot from them myself. You have the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. You have the Reader in Marxist Philosophy from the writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, published by international publishers. You have this other book, Dialectical Materialism, by F.G. Afanassiev from the Soviet Union. You have the Antología del Materialismo Dialéctico, published in Mexico City, which was also really great because it had a lot of information that related to Latin America and the Caribbean specifically. And last but not least, Quotations from Chairman Mao, which has a lot of good information about contradiction and struggles within social movements and how dialectical and historical materialism can be applied to understanding revolution. So again, this was episode 13 of Decolonizing Media, the Science of Marxism. Thanks again for listening and watching. Make sure to follow us at Anticonquista on Facebook, Twitter, and IG. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. If you're interested in submitting content to us at any time, hit us up, info@anticonquista.com. You can also check out our website, anticonquista.com/submissions, and you can get a sense of what kind of content we're looking for. We're always looking for articles, videos, podcasts, memes, anything that will help spread communist and anti-imperialist ideas among our people. And make sure to go to patreon.com/anticonquista and become a patron today. As I mentioned in the intro, only part of the money that we collect goes to pay for our website and podcast hosting fees. The rest goes directly to groups in Latin America and the Caribbean that are serving the people and carrying out revolutionary struggle. So thanks again for listening and watching Decolonizing Media. Decolonizing Media is a video podcast dedicated to exposing capitalist and imperialist ideology in mainstream media. I hope you have a great week. Que vayan paz.